Imagine this. Parents report their own 4-year-old child missing, crying to emergency services, but investigators quickly realize the entire call was a complete fabrication after unsealing the physical evidence. Cell phone tracking data, vehicle location logs, and forensic discoveries inside the family home completely destroyed their cover story. If Javeayah Harris had vanished outside like they claimed, why did forensic sweeps find proof of a violent assault and a highly coordinated cleanup inside their own walls? Today, we break down the exact digital and forensic evidence that forced a confession, exposed the cover-up, and left both parents denied bond. Subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now. If you want the verified facts on the most disturbing investigations, hit that like button and join us. Let's talk about how this all actually started, because the way this case opened is something that shakes a community to its absolute core. It was June 30th, 2026. A 22-year-old mother named Michelet Monique Herring picked up her phone in Aiken County, South Carolina, and dialed 911. On the surface, it is every parent's absolute worst nightmare, right? She told the emergency dispatcher that her 4-year-old daughter, little Javeayah Harris, was missing. She claimed the child was just gone. When you think about a 4-year-old girl, you think about how dependent they are, how small they are in this big world. At that age, they trust the adults around them completely for their safety and their survival. When emergency services hear a frantic call about a toddler vanishing, the response is immediate and overwhelming. Javeayah's father, 23-year-old Javeayah Harris, didn't just stay quiet either. He actually went out and spoke to local news outlets. He stood right in front of cameras, looking into the lenses, and claimed that some unknown, suspicious individuals had been seen snooping around their property recently. He was planting a seed in the public's mind. The parents presented this terrifying narrative to everyone: a sudden, completely unexplained disappearance. They painted a picture where someone snatched their little girl, or she wandered off into the summer heat and met with foul play by a complete stranger. And when a helpless child goes missing, a community does not hesitate to step up. Law enforcement agencies immediately launched a massive search operation. They treated the situation exactly as they should have, as a critical missing child case where every single second could be the difference between life and death. You had sheriff's deputies working overtime, sweating through their uniforms. You had search dogs brought in to sniff through the brush and the neighborhood streets. Every day, community volunteers left their jobs, their families, and their comfortable homes to scour the area surrounding the family's house. Imagine being a neighbor, walking through the woods with a flashlight, screaming this little girl's name until your voice is completely hoarse, totally unaware of what investigators were about to find. People really cared. They put their hearts into finding Javeayah. But here is where things take a deeply disturbing turn. Wow. You see, the physical evidence gathered in those crucial first 24 hours told a completely different story than the one the parents were selling on the news. According to the Aiken County Sheriff's Office, the narrative that the parents provided collapsed almost instantly. It didn't take weeks of complex deductions. The story fell apart as soon as crime scene investigators secured a warrant to officially step inside and search the family residence. When forensic teams sweep a home, they aren't looking for stories, and they aren't listening to tears. They don't care about what someone said on the local news broadcast. They are looking for cold, hard, physical data. They are searching for the truth left behind in the environment, data that simply cannot be altered by a person's testimony or a fabricated alibi. So, police went inside, and what they documented inside that home was absolutely heartbreaking. Instead of an ordinary house where a little girl simply opened a door and walked out to play, investigators documented blood evidence. They noted clear signs of a physical struggle having taken place inside those walls. And frankly, this is where the empathy for this child really hits hard. Javeayah was just 4 years old. A home is supposed to be a child's ultimate safe haven. It is where they are supposed to be protected from the dangers of the outside world. But the forensics team found something else entirely. They found evidence of a highly coordinated cleanup effort. Investigators explicitly stated that someone had actively tried to scrub the crime scene to hide what had happened to Javeayah. They tried to wipe away the violent reality. But forensic science doesn't let you just wipe away the truth. You can use all the cleaning supplies in the cabinet, you can throw away rugs, and you can scrub the floors, but forensic tools like luminol will find exactly what you leave behind. The blood trace evidence will glow. This physical reality directly contradicted the parents' claim that Javeayah had simply vanished from the outside of the property. If she went missing from the front yard like they claimed, why was someone allegedly scrubbing blood evidence off the surfaces inside the house? I see cases like this quite often, and that kind of disconnect between the story and the physical scene is always the first massive red flag for police. To completely break the parents' timeline, investigators turned away from the house and looked closely at electronic data. We all carry a massive digital footprint in our pockets every single day. In modern investigations, physical evidence on the ground is almost always backed up by these invisible digital footprints in the air. Law enforcement successfully extracted the cell phone data from the devices belonging to both Javeayah Harris and Javeayah Harris. Now think about how your smartphone works. Even if you aren't actively making a phone call or sending a text message, your phone is constantly reaching out. It is always pinging local cell towers just to keep a network signal. That constant pinging creates a very precise time-stamped map of your physical movements. You cannot fake it, and you cannot easily erase it once the service provider has it on their servers. According to police, the location data they pulled from the parents' devices completely and utterly destroyed their fabricated timeline. The parents had told police they were at specific places doing specific things leading up to that frantic 911 call on June 30th. But the local cell towers said otherwise. The digital data definitively proved they were not where they claimed to be. It is a truly chilling thought, isn't it? While they were publicly crying out for help, pointing fingers at imaginary strangers, and sending desperate search parties into the woods, their own digital devices were silently recording the unvarnished truth. They likely thought they had crafted the perfect, untouchable cover story. But the cell phone pings showed a completely different route of travel. It showed movement that made absolutely no logical sense for parents who were supposedly frantically searching their own neighborhood for a lost toddler. The police stated that the timeline wasn't just slightly off due to the stress or panic of the moment. It was a total and deliberate fabrication. But the investigators did not stop with just the cell phones. They took that mobile network data and matched it up with vehicle location logs and local surveillance footage. If you drive a modern car or if you carry a smartphone while driving, your vehicle is quietly logging an incredible amount of information. It tracks your speed, your stops, and your exact GPS coordinates. Investigators pulled the telematics tracking data straight from the parents' vehicle. This specific data pinpointed their exact movements during a very critical gap in time, the hours right before they finally decided to pick up the phone and call emergency services. And what did this vehicle data show? It did not show a frantic stop-and-go search pattern up and down the local streets looking for a wandering child. Instead, police said the data logs led search teams completely away from the Aiken County home. The vehicle tracking pointed them toward a totally different location, traveling roughly 2 hours away from where the parents claimed Javeayah went missing. I want you to just picture that drive for a second. Driving hours away from your community, knowing exactly what happened inside your home while planning the story you are going to tell the police. The court documents indicate that they were driving out into Fairfield County, far away from the initial search grid. By comparing the exact time the parents verbally told police they last saw their daughter with the exact GPS coordinates of their vehicle and their phones, the investigators reached a devastating but undeniable conclusion. Police formally stated that the missing person report was not a simple mistake, and it was not a confused panic response. It was a knowing and deliberate falsehood designed to mislead a massive police response. In an era where every phone, every vehicle, and every neighborhood doorbell camera is logging your location, is it even possible for a suspect to maintain a fabricated timeline under deep police scrutiny? The data gathered in this case strongly suggests it is absolutely not. You simply cannot outsmart the digital grid. The electronic evidence provided a rigid, undeniable map of their actual actions. Because of this overwhelming wave of data, it forced the entire investigation to execute a hard pivot. It was no longer a rescue operation for a lost little girl. Law enforcement shifted it fully into a homicide inquiry based entirely on the cold, hard facts recorded by machines, servers, and forensic tools. It is incredibly tragic. We are talking about a child whose life was cut violently short, and instead of seeking immediate medical help, the state alleges her parents spent their time and energy trying to cover it up. They used the media, they used the goodwill of their worried neighbors, and they manipulated the 911 emergency system to put on a show. But the digital and physical evidence stripped all of those lies away. They thought they could control the narrative and fool the police. But in the end, the blood found inside the home, the silent pings on the cell towers, and the GPS logs in the car spoke up for little Javeayah when she no longer could. So, as all of this digital and physical evidence steadily mounted, the investigation took on an entirely different weight. The medical and forensic pathology findings began to come back, and they finally started to fill in the rest of this devastating timeline. And I have to warn you, the facts here are incredibly heavy. Law enforcement formally stated that Javeayah did not go missing on June 30. That date, that frantic 911 call, the tearful news interviews, all of it was a complete fabrication. According to the rigid timeline meticulously built by investigators, the child had actually been deceased for weeks before emergency services were ever even contacted. Wow. I just need you to really hear that and let it sink in. We are talking about a tiny 4-year-old girl. According to the unsealed court documents, investigators allege that Javeayah's body was kept right there inside the family's residence, somewhere between May 1st and June 15th, 2026, right? It is profoundly difficult to process that as a human being. When we think of a family home, we think of a safe space. We think of toys on the floor and morning cartoons. But for a month and a half, that home allegedly held a dark, terrible reality. You think about the neighbors next door watering their lawns in the warm May weather. You think about the mail carrier stopping by every single afternoon to drop off letters. Life was just carrying on normally on the outside, completely unaware of the heartbreaking situation unfolding right behind those locked doors. The estimated time of death provided by the medical professionals combined with the physical evidence found during that intense home sweep created a massive, unbridgeable gap between actual reality and the parents' frantic 911 call. They didn't just hesitate for a few hours because they were scared. They constructed a completely alternate reality that stretched across weeks. They lived in that house. They walked those hallways. They knew exactly what had happened while the rest of the world remained completely in the dark. So what happens when detectives finally have all the pieces of a puzzle this dark? They sit the suspects down. When investigators finally confronted the parents with this unyielding scientific data, the blood sweeps from their own floors, the vehicle GPS logs tracing their exact routes, and the cell phone tracking pinging off distant towers, the cover story just completely broke down. I see people assume these interrogations are always full of yelling and table pounding, like a dramatic scene in a Hollywood movie. But in reality, when the evidence is this strong, the room is often very quiet. It was not a matter of detectives wearing the suspects down in a cold room for 20 hours of grueling questioning. It was simply the presentation of objective, undeniable facts that they simply could not explain away. You cannot argue with a cell tower. You cannot outsmart a forensic luminol test. Faced with a massive mountain of physical data proving they were lying about their whereabouts, the truth finally started to come out. Police said that Javeayah Harris eventually admitted to disposing of her daughter's body at a completely separate location. The confrontation with the physical data is what forced these admissions. She saw the GPS logs mapping out their drive away from the house, and she knew the game was over. There was no more room to hide behind the story of a wandering child. If you haven't subscribed to U.S. crime cases yet, hit that button now. We break down the real facts, keeping you informed on these investigations. Following those admissions and the overwhelming weight of the physical evidence, both parents were subsequently arrested and taken into custody. The state moved swiftly, formally charging both Javeayah Harris and Javeayah Harris with homicide by child abuse. Now, because of that fabricated 911 call that triggered the massive, unnecessary search effort by the community, Herring also received an additional charge of filing a false police report. To truly understand the gravity of what is happening in this case, we have to look at the exact legal standard for these charges. Homicide by child abuse in this specific jurisdiction requires the state to prove that the accused caused the death of a child under circumstances manifesting an extreme indifference to human life. That phrase, extreme indifference, is chilling when you really break it down. It means you saw a vulnerable human being in absolute distress, and you simply did not care enough to help them. The arrest warrants explicitly stated that the parents knew the child was severely injured. They knew she was hurt, and yet they deliberately failed to seek medical attention. If your child falls or gets seriously hurt, your first instinct as a parent is to call a doctor, to call an ambulance, to do absolutely whatever it takes to save them. Instead, the state alleges they let her slip away. The prosecution relies heavily on the forensic evidence, the blood trace data, and this sprawling timeline of concealment to meet this heavy burden of proof in state court. Because Javeayah cannot take the stand to tell her own story, the silence of the evidence has to speak for her. The data has to be her voice. This direct clash between the suspect's desperate actions and the cold, hard physical data took center stage immediately during the initial court proceedings. Let's step into the courtroom for a moment to understand what is going on now. During the formal bond hearings, an Aiken County judge had to sit down and evaluate whether these parents should be granted the privilege of bail while awaiting their trial. In that courtroom setting, prosecutors stood up and presented the raw facts extracted straight from the digital logs and the home search. They argued strongly that the parents posed a severe, undeniable risk of flight, and they made this argument by pointing directly to the extreme, calculated steps the parents had already taken to hide evidence and alter the crime scene. Think about it from a logical, legal perspective. If a person is willing to scrub a crime scene in their own home and drive hours away to hide a tragedy, what is stopping them from fleeing the state entirely if they are let out on bail? The deeply disturbing nature of the concealment, keeping the child's body in the home for weeks before finally moving it to another county, demonstrated a clear, calculated pattern of evasion. This wasn't a sudden, chaotic panic. It was a sustained, deliberate cover-up over a long period of time. It takes a certain mindset to wake up every day for weeks knowing what you are hiding from the world. On the other side of the courtroom, the defense attorneys were present following standard legal protocol. It is always important to remember they were there representing their clients' constitutional rights during these proceedings. Everyone is entitled to a robust defense in our justice system, and the lawyers were simply doing their job to advocate for the accused. However, the physical evidence logs presented by the state were just overwhelmingly powerful to overcome. The judge listened closely to both sides, weighing the arguments against the severity of the situation. Ultimately, he deferred the bond decisions. He stated firmly from the bench that the court did not even have the authority to set bond in this specific instance due to the extreme severity of the homicide by child abuse charges. So both parents were formally denied bail. They were remanded straight back into custody, pending further decisions by a circuit court judge. The absolute legal reality here is that maintaining a frantic public plea for a missing child is completely impossible to defend when your own electronic and physical footprints are actively tracking a coordinated cleanup and disposal effort. The truth always leaves a mark, and in this case, those marks are ensuring that the pursuit of justice for Javeayah continues moving forward. So with the parents firmly remanded into custody and the bond denied by the judge, the investigation didn't just stop. It actually shifted smoothly into its final and honestly its most heartbreaking phase. We have to talk about how they actually found her. The focus of the entire operation moved completely away from the neighborhood and centered on recovery. We discussed how those vehicle location logs destroyed the parents' initial story, right? Well, they did a lot more than just poke holes in an alibi. They actually drew a highly precise map for the search teams. Because the digital forensics extracted from the car pointed so far away from the family home in Aiken County, the authorities had to pack up their operations and completely relocate. Based directly on the electronic timeline, investigators tracked the parents' route roughly 2 hours away to Fairfield County. I want you to just sit and think about that drive for a second. 2 hours. That is a very long time to sit in a car. It's a long time to think about what you are doing, especially when you know what is in the vehicle with you. This wasn't a panicked, split-second decision made in the heat of the moment right next to their house. According to the data police gathered, this was a sustained, calculated 2-hour journey away from their own community. Wow. It is incredibly heavy to process the reality of that timeline. The electronic GPS logs eventually led investigators to narrow their focus specifically on Cedar Creek Reservoir, which is a large body of water in the area. Now, when you're looking at a vast, open, outdoor area like a reservoir, you can't just wander around the shoreline hoping to get lucky. You have to rely completely on the science. Investigators used the precise grid mapped out by the vehicle's telematics to guide the search teams step by step. And sadly, following that exact electronic breadcrumb trail led them right to what they were looking for. Search teams located partial human remains at the site. Hearing that outcome is always tough. I see cases like this often, and that is the moment your heart just sinks. The sheriff stepped up to a podium and confirmed these devastating findings to the public. But in the eyes of the law, you can't just assume anything. So police stated that the remains were immediately transferred to the State Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, for rapid DNA testing. They had to be absolutely sure who they had found. A short time later, police confirmed what everyone already feared. They stated clearly that the testing results were consistent with the biological offspring of Javeayah Harris and Javeayah Harris. The data and the DNA officially identified the victim as little Javeayah. The cover story was officially dead. This specific outcome really underscores a major reality in modern true crime investigations. We see it happening more and more in courtrooms today. Science and electronic data are acting as an unyielding voice for victims who simply cannot speak for themselves. I think about this all the time when looking at these tragedies. Because a 4-year-old child cannot take the stand, she can't point a finger, and she can't testify to a jury about what happened to her behind those closed doors. She had no phone to call for help, and she couldn't run to a neighbor. The parents held all the power in that home. So prosecutors and police must rely entirely on other methods. They have to lean heavily on the blood sweeps, the electronic records, and the pathology reports to rebuild the timeline of events from the ground up. It is the convergence of all this data that changes everything. Think about it. The physical home sweep proving a cleanup happened, the cell tower triangulation proving they weren't frantically searching their neighborhood, and the vehicle GPS mapping a 2-hour path straight to a reservoir. When you put them all together, they force the truth into the light. That data is exactly what secured the current homicide charges against the parents. As we look at the raw facts of this case, I think we really have to look closely at how the legal system handles this specific type of evidence. It is one thing for police to gather the data, but it is another thing entirely to use it to secure a conviction in front of a judge and a jury. Let's discuss a few specific points based purely on the unsealed information we have so far. I want to know what you think about how the system is working here. First, let's talk about the digital footprint. The state filed charges of homicide by child abuse based heavily on electronic timeline data and home forensic sweeps. There isn't an adult eyewitness here who can say exactly what happened. Do you believe digital tracking has completely changed the game for securing accountability in hidden domestic crimes? 10 or 15 years ago, If a crime happened inside a private home and the parents had a unified, rehearsed story, it was incredibly difficult for police to break through that wall. A cleaned-up room might have been enough to cast reasonable doubt. Today, your own car and your own phone will silently testify against you. Do you feel this level of digital tracking makes it virtually impossible for suspects to maintain a fabricated cover story today? Second, let's look at what happened during the bond hearing. The judge specifically cited the concealment of evidence as a primary reason to deny bail. Now, from a strictly legal standpoint, we have to ask a tough question. Does a highly coordinated cover-up automatically prove prior intent to commit a crime? Or should the two actions, the death of the child and the cover-up, be judged completely separately? I see people debating this all the time. On one hand, moving a body and scrubbing a floor shows a very clear, calculated understanding of guilt. On the other hand, a defense attorney will argue that sheer panic can make innocent people do completely irrational things after an accident. But when the data shows a weeks-long cover-up and a 2-hour drive, does the panic defense hold any actual weight in court? Third, let's look at the specific charges themselves. The suspects are currently facing charges of homicide by child abuse and destruction of evidence, rather than a standard first-degree premeditated murder charge. The legal threshold for extreme indifference to human life is incredibly high. In high-profile cases like this, which rely so heavily on digital and physical footprints, is denying bond a necessary measure to protect the integrity of the pending trial. The court said they did not even have the authority to grant bond for charges this severe. Is keeping them securely in custody the only way to ensure the remaining digital or physical evidence stays perfectly intact? Finally, we come back to the core of this entire tragedy. Because the youngest, most vulnerable victims cannot testify, prosecutors must rely almost entirely on blood sweeps, electronic records, and pathology reports to rebuild the timeline. We are trusting machines, data grids, and forensic science to deliver justice. Does this heavy reliance on scientific data create a higher, more reliable standard of justice in our courtrooms today? When we remove human memory and human bias from the witness stand and replace it with GPS logs and DNA, are we getting much closer to the absolute truth? It is honestly devastating to look at the massive window between May 1st and June 15th. That is a long time where a little girl's life had ended and the world just kept turning. When police stated the missing person report on June 30th was a knowing falsehood, it wasn't just a lie to law enforcement. It was a lie to every single neighbor who went out into the summer heat to look for her. But we have to stay grounded in the facts as the justice system requires. The accused are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. What we do know right now is that the fabricated call has been completely exposed. The confessions regarding moving the body are formally logged by investigators, and both parents remain held in a jail cell without bond. How does forensic science redefine the pursuit of justice in our courtrooms? Please share your objective analysis in the comments below. Thank you for staying until the very end of this video. If you appreciate the facts, please subscribe as we track more verified criminal investigations.